Hello gardeners, welcome back. Lindsay here with the Mindful Living Movement. If we've never met before or you're new to this space, I am an urban organic gardener teaching all of the ways that I have found to grow an abundant garden scattered around in sort of odd little places within my yard and helping you to find all the tiny spaces that you can squeak in a new food productive plant and also work within some really challenging spaces where you've got maybe buildings and trees and fences and all sorts of things that might be competing for your sun. That is my specialty. So stick around. Today we're going to talk about watering and actually how to figure out if you're doing it right, because it's probably one of the top questions that I get is, am I watering enough? Am I watering too much? How do I know if I'm actually watering my garden correctly? And it is a fabulous question because it's an important one. If we think about the things that our plants need to thrive, they need sun, they need nutrients, and they need moisture. So if we don't meet those three requirements, one of them being moisture, they're going to be sad. And consistency is very important because the yo-yo effect of drying out, overwater, drying out, that causes big stress on our plants. Stress equals not so much production or maybe no production at all, and that's not what we're here for. We want those beautiful, healthy, productive plants that are going to feed us and nourish us. So how do we figure out what's actually going on? Now, correct watering is a sliding scale. It's not a hard and fast answer, so I'm going to take you through a few things to sort of help you get familiar with what's happening in your garden and also sort of tune in and dial in that watering over the whole season. Now, something that we are often told as gardeners is, well, your garden needs 1 to 2 inches of water per week. Well, I don't find that very helpful information. The only way that that's helpful information is if you get consistent rain every week and if you have rain gauges scattered around your yard. So get yourself a couple of rain gauges. I definitely recommend having those. Put them in a couple different areas of your garden because wind and buildings and different things like that might affect, how the wind or the rain, drops in your garden. So that's definitely a good place to start. But I don't get enough rain every week for that to be something that's really, really, really going to help me. So that's where I move on to sort of two things. One of two things is get yourself a moisture meter. These things are so, so helpful. And after that, just your finger. Our sense of touch and ability to identify moisture is so powerful. Honestly, it's my number one tool. Sticking my finger in the dirt, in my pots, everything to figure out actually what's going on there. But these two in tandem, because obviously our fingers are not a full, 12 inches long. We can't get them all the way down into the bottom of pots and stuff like that. So this is a really lovely tool to have as well. And you can see on there is a 1, it tells me it's super dry. A 4, it tells me it is super wet. And there's some that give you even more. This is just a very, very basic one that can tell you tons more information than this. So if you are a new or advanced gardener, still having this tool on standby, they're pretty inexpensive. I think I picked this one up for like 10, 12 bucks. Is a good thing to have around. Now, over this season, as our heat intensifies, as our sun gets stronger, we're going to need to be bringing in more moisture. And also as our plants sort of establish themselves, especially if they're in the ground, they're going to be able to send down roots a little bit further and reach more water reserves. But also as those plants grow, they're going to require more water. So we need to figure out what's actually going on. And for myself, I don't actually hand water too much of my garden, except for maybe the beginning of the year. At this point, I've got everything set up on my drip irrigation system. But I need to know, how much time do I need to be sticking on my irrigation? Or if you're hand watering your garden or your pots, how long do you stand there watering your plant? How much moisture do you actually decide on to give that plant? So that is what we are going to talk about. I'm going to take you through, especially the beginning of the season, as you get later in the season, sort of the things to look for in your soil. So first things first, best practices of watering is typically the earliest part of the day that you possibly can. Get out there, water before the heat of the day comes up, water before the sun starts to bake your plants so that this moisture can actually penetrate down deep into the soil and so that your plants have had some time to actually uptake some moisture and prepare themselves. If you're watering in the middle of the day, that super, super crazy hot high noon potentially, your plants are just not going to have the ability to really fully absorb, and neither is your soil or all that organic matter in your soil. So get a little jump on it. So that is going to be kind of step 1. Best practice, water early in the day as much as you can, or late into the evening. I much prefer the morning method though, because if you have gotten moisture on the leaves of the plants have a chance to actually dry throughout the day, which is going to significantly reduce your chance for fungal diseases and things like that to come up. Next most important thing, I talk a lot about touch to give you perspective on actually what's going on in your moisture. So what we need to do is we need to figure out and we need to find our soil getting to be sort of that wrung out sponge type consistency throughout the whole day. Now definitely after you've just watered your plant, it's going to be sopping wet and kind of like muddy. So when you stick your finger in the soil, that's probably what you're going to discover, definitely in those top 2 inches. And then use that moisture meter just to check in that you have gotten the moisture as far down as you possibly can into the soil. So expect very sopping, muddy, wet in the early, right after you've watered. But once you hit that midday mark, you probably shouldn't see any sopping, muddy, wet soil anymore. It will have started to sort of dry out, definitely on the surface, but even below the surface. If it is like super waterlogged and it is still that muddy, then we've probably got too much water or not enough time was given in between watering from, day to day. If you are discovering that already at your midday point, that even way down in, that end of your moisture meter or at the bottom of your pot is already dry soil sort of has like a dusty type feeling to it. It's sometimes almost like sand, like powdery. Then we know we need to add more moisture at the time that we're watering, or we need to bring our timing between waterings closer to one another. Okay, so that's the next thing that we need to check on. So from morning to noon, usually we won't have any issues unless you're growing in like maybe a teeny tiny little pot and it's a super crazy hot day. Probably we won't have any issues or discover that we have, significantly underwatered by that stretch. Once you get to the evening, check again. Start to see, okay, how is the soil dried out? Where are we at? Are we still having, moisture at least 3 or 4 inches down below consistently? If you're in a pot, definitely add a little bit more moisture. If you're in a garden bed and the top little bit of the soil is dried out, but you can still see that there's a decent amount of moisture down and below, don't do anything, just leave it until the very next day. If you're growing in the soil, you can quite oftentimes go sometimes even a couple of days without, watering, but then giving a good deep watering because that water can sort of penetrate all the way down and the plants can access it, which is kind of nice. But test it out and see based on the temperatures that you're getting. Sort of look ahead a little bit and get acquainted with if you're hitting those, say, like 30 degrees Celsius days or you're like 90 to 100 Fahrenheit days, probably you're going to have to water every single day. That's just kind of the reality of it because your plants are going to get very stressed out otherwise, and that is not what we want. Now, after that, as the day warms, as the sun hits, as the plants start to uptake, the moisture levels are going to drop and you're going to see the surface of your soil start to dry out. Don't panic if the surface of your soil is dry. Most of my garden, like this one area, I've got the overhead sprayers on because I'm still getting seeds to germinate, but eventually I'm going to turn off those overhead sprayers, which means that the top of my soil, even after it gets watered on a drip irrigation, it actually still looks dry. So it's kind of a bit of a thing that's kind of tricky with the mind, but it's not what's happening on the surface, it's what's happening down below. So if you aren't getting into drip irrigation, please know that it is a little bit of that iceberg effect. Wherever the little drip emitter is coming out of the hose and it's dropping water, you're going to see a little soil spot, maybe a big one, but it's not going to be huge, but it's this effect. This is the little drop of water you're seeing, and then underneath the surface, that water just disperses like crazy. And once your plants are really established, they can access all of that. So don't get too excited about necessarily what's happening on the top of the soil. It's what's happening underneath the surface. So if you're brand new to, getting familiar with what is happening in your soil moisture, I would recommend coming outside, especially in the early part of the season when your plants are still teeny tiny and they haven't established big root structures, is come out at noon, come out in the evening, stick your finger in the soil, stick your moisture meter in the soil, and just check and see if you know, if you still have good even moisture, go around, test it out, add a little bit more if you need, or you can the next day spend a little more time saturating the soil. Again, check noon and later in the day, and just sort of learn how your plants are uptaking water and how the soil is drying out for you. And this is a good practice for every single gardener, whether you're new or not, at different times of the season, because once you hit those really, really crazy hot days, you might actually need to be watering in the evening. Like, for example, sometimes I have to turn on my irrigation morning and night, depending on what we're having happen for temperatures. We have some pretty wild swings of temperatures here. We go from like freezing to super crazy hot in the span of just a few weeks sometimes. So that's a lot to get used to. And it's a little bit different depending on the kind of soil that you have as well. So the more organic matter, so things like compost and manure, or even, you know, broken down tree mulch, the more organic matter that you're putting into your soil, the better it's going to consistently hold moisture for you, which is amazing. But if you're starting out with sort of a really clay-based soil, which is really compacted, sometimes moisture has a hard time getting down into it, but it holds moisture for a really long time. So you could get between waterings a little bit more maybe. Proceed with caution if you know that you have a more clay soil. In my instance, most of my garden beds now, they're very well established. They're into like their 9th year with lots of organic matter. But I do have some newer beds still that are almost sitting entirely on top of sand. That is sort of what our area here is built on, and sand sucks away moisture like crazy. So I have really implemented using tree mulch a lot of spaces, especially newer areas that I'm developing in my yard, that I want to make sure that I'm keeping the moisture so those plants actually have a fighting chance. So I use a lot of tree mulch and things like that to help keep moisture and help give me a little bit longer in between waterings. Now, the other thing we can look at are plants themselves and the leaves to see what is actually taking place. Now, this is not definitely the final indicator, but wilty leaves sometimes can mean that your plants don't have enough moisture. So wilty leaves combined with you sticking your finger in the soil, sticking your moisture meter in the soil, and discovering that you do have very, very dry soil, those two things combined definitely get some water into your plants. If you're seeing those really, really droopy leaves plus dry soil, and if that's happening a lot in between your waterings, bring the waterings closer together, or if you can, add a little bit extra moisture at each time that you're watering so that you sort of even things out a little bit. The tricky thing about wilty leaves is that some plants, if they get overwatered or they're just hot, they will wilt. So tomatoes are one of those. Tomatoes wilt leaves if they are just stressed, period, for a whole host of reasons. Too much water, not enough water, too windy, too cold, you name it. So especially if it's one of your tomatoes or peppers, if you see wilty leaves, don't immediately water. Go and test, stick your finger in the soil, stick your moisture meter, see what's going on underneath the surface. If you discover that you do have decent moisture in there, or even a lot of moisture in there, maybe back off your watering just a little bit, because potentially you have overwatered your plants. Now, the other family of plants is your cucurbits, so things like cucumbers, squash, pumpkins, what else, zucchini, anything in that family. Even if they have really good moisture in the soil, those really midday hot temperatures in the middle of the summertime, their leaves get really sad and they just don't look like their happiest selves. But if the evening comes along and they perk right back up and they're looking beautiful in the evening, and you've checked all day long, you had consistent moisture, perfect, do nothing, just continue watering as you are. This is normal. You can't add more water to perk them up and make them happier. It's just simply an effect of the temperature that is happening in midday. So don't panic if that is what you are seeing. So the third indicator, if you're looking at your plants, is potentially yellowing of leaves. So yellowing of leaves typically starts kind of on the bottom of the plant, and it will sort of spread its way up the plant. Now, yellowing is an indicator of a whole bunch of different things that could potentially be going wrong with your plant, but it is often, the common denominator is too much moisture. So if you are seeing that, again, don't just look at the visually on the plant, don't just look at the surface of your soil, you got to actually figure out what's happening underneath the surface of your soil. Stick your finger in there, get your moisture meter in there, and actually figure out, is there a lot of moisture? Is it constantly just sitting in soppy, wet soil, and is it not drying out in between? And if it's not drying out in between, just give it more space for that to actually happen before you start adding any extra moisture to, you know, your plant itself. If you are finding that you are giving it time to dry out in between, maybe not bone dry, but, you know, dropping down to just a little bit of moisture in the soil and then you top it back up, then potentially we're into maybe more like nutrient deficient type issues. But that's a whole nother video and we're not going to talk about that today. We're going to just focus on watering and making sure that our plants are getting what they need in that regards. So if you are growing, I don't know if you can hear that bird, but we have a new bird in the yard and it's so pretty. So if you're growing in pots, pots require a little bit more paying attention to water because there is just a finite amount of soil that you've got in this pot for the roots to be able to access moisture. They hit a point, they can't send their roots out into the ground. So if you are growing in pots, just a couple things to sort of help you get through really, really hot days. Going bigger with your pots is definitely better. Also, not stuffing a crazy amount of plants in each single pot. I know it looks beautiful to have your plants just spilling all over your pots, but it's just going to mean that you're going to have to water your plants a lot more. If you're someone like me who likes the ability to just go away for a couple days on a whim and you don't want to have to arrange someone to water your garden, you know, I've got it all set up here that everything you can see, I've got 5-gallon pails. I've only got 2 cucumbers growing in each of these 5-gallon pails. I've got a bunch of lemon balm, a thing of mint, but there's not very many plants here because I know this space that I have here, there's a lot of heat that's radiated off of the driveway. There's a lot of heat that comes off of this fence. This area gets a ton of sun. So I've tried to set it up in a way that I'm going to be able to keep long, consistent moisture throughout the day. But again, once it gets to the really hot midsummer days, I'm definitely going to have to be out here more morning and night and really, really checking in to make sure that these guys are getting what they need. And that's where this is going to come in because I can stick it way down and actually see what's hanging out in the bottom of my pot, and see if my plant actually still has moisture to be able to access. Because pots dry out a lot quicker, and as I mentioned, the root structure is a lot shallower, just doesn't quite have the same space, especially teeny tiny little pots. Those guys you might even have to pull right out of the sun for really, really hot days because they will just get cooked. If you're gone to work all day and it's, you know, just in a teeny tiny, maybe like 10-inch pot or something like that, and it's getting full sun all day, you will probably notice that your plant is wilting and maybe it's crispy, maybe it is, the soil is bone dry. So bigger pots are definitely always better for helping with sort of long, consistent moisture. Obviously you don't want to drown them either, so get familiar with what it looks like to water the pot well, let the moisture drain out the bottom, check noon, check at the evening if you can, and sort of figure out what that happy medium is for the point in the season that you're at. We're looking for sort of wrung out moisture, wrung out sponge moisture, but not dusty and dry, not sopping and muddy over the whole day. That's sort of the balance that we're trying to find. So if you have plants like tomatoes, particularly grown in pots, another thing that you can see if you are overwatering is splitting fruits. So this means the plant has sucked up way too much water way too quickly and the fruit has expanded to the point where it cracked and it split it. If that is something that is happening, you're going to need to back off on the saturation levels of what you're giving your plant at one time and maybe give it a little bit less moisture at that time, but potentially add in another watering. This can happen in pots, and I say this particularly in pots because the pots themselves can only hold so much, and if we notice that our plant is drying out, we're seeing, you know, bone dry soil, leaves are wilty and sad, the tendency is to just throw a whole bunch of water at it because we want to, you know, make it happy again, and it'll suck all of that up, but then you're going to cause damage to the fruits. Even blossom end rot is often a over or under watering yo-yo effect that's happening in your plant. So be cautious of potted plants because that is just their nature. You just have to be a little bit better at paying attention to and keeping consistency. You don't want to completely drown the plant, let it go dusty, drown the plant, let it go dusty. That's going to cause mega stress in your plants. We want to find that balance where it can dry out, it still holds a tiny bit of moisture. We bring it back up to being, saturated, let it dry out, and usually in the span of a day or so, especially once we get to midsummer, then that's a good sort of time frame. In the spring parts of the season, you can maybe get 2 days, maybe even 3 days, because your temperatures aren't there and your plants are not as big and they're not quite as demanding of their water needs. And lastly, to help your soil maintain more moisture consistently for longer and help you to not have to be watering quite as much and just keep your plants a little bit healthier, there's different things that you can place onto the top of the soil to help with, keeping the sun from baking it and causing that evaporation to occur. Straw is a really common one because it's easy to lay down in between the rows of your plants. Also a like composted tree mulch. What else? Wood chips, if you've got anything like that you can sort of sprinkle on the top of the soil and just keep a barrier from the sun getting straight to the soil. That is amazing. Also, leaf growth on your plants. If you are growing like the classic Three Sisters growing method, the squash themselves, they grow around on the ground in between your corn, which grow really tall, and your beans climb up the corn. But the reason this is a great partner method throughout the garden is squash get big, beautiful leaves. They shade the soil. They block the sun from getting that. So if you've got big, open, bare patches of soil, stick some plants in there. Maximize your garden space if you want to. Get some flowers in there because that too can help. Just that leaf growth filling in is going to help keep your moisture throughout the soil and help to eliminate the amount of time that you have to be out there kind of paying attention and making sure everything's going proper. All right, you got this. So if you are still feeling a little bit unsure of how much water, when to water, all of that kind of stuff, just get out there, stick your finger in the dirt, get yourself a little moisture meter, even add in a rain gauge just so you can actually sort of see how much rain you're getting when it does happen. But at the end of the day, it is a sliding scale. So there's not a for sure solid answer, but you need to get acquainted with your garden, your unique soil, even the soil from one space to another. If you've got more established garden beds versus others that are maybe brand new and you haven't been adding in that organic matter, you might notice that the ones that haven't had a lot of compost over the years, they dry out a little bit quicker. So get familiar with your unique space, maybe even make yourself a little gardening journal so that you can reflect back to future seasons and see, okay, at the beginning of the year, I was, watering every 1 to 2 days for this area, whereas in the middle of the summer, I had to water twice a day. Your pots, the same thing. Get out there, water solidly in the morning, and then just sort of for the first couple of weeks, especially while your plants are new and establishing themselves, check in if you can twice a day. At the very least, water in the morning, check in the evening. If you're good to go overnight, amazing. If you check again in the morning and you still don't need moisture, awesome. And kind of go from there. It's a tough, solid answer to give because everybody's garden is a little bit different, our soil is a little bit different, and our weather changes from season to season. Also, the bigger your plants get, the more that they will require. But knowing that if you're growing in the ground, you have a little bit more ability to water and saturate the soil and then go longer because the plants are going to be able to get down and access that water, whereas your pots, almost always pots are just going to require a little bit more of your attention and that balanced watering effect. If you have plants that are, say like tomatoes or cucumbers, that that you're not super diligent at watering consistently, and you have the option to maybe stick them in the ground versus putting them in the pots, that would always be my choice. Is I choose to stick them in the ground first versus putting them in the pots because I just know that how I am with watering, I like to really set it and forget it and not have to worry quite that much about it. This is why my garden's on drip irrigation. But if you don't have the option and you just have space for pots and containers and things like that, go as big as you can, comfortably afford, or get creative. Big Tupperware containers, anything like that you can put a good solid amount of soil into. You saw those 5-gallon pails that I showed you that my cucumbers were growing in. 5-gallon pails are pretty much my minimum for growing a couple of cucumber plants or one single tomato plant. And if I can, I go even bigger than that, because that just helps out keep a happy plant. It helps keep a happy gardening mom, because I don't have to be out there worrying about stress plants or underwatering or overwatering. And yeah, but have fun with it. Get to know your garden. This is sort of part of the process. A part of gardening is just spending time in it, learning about it, feeling it out, and yeah, enjoy all of your time out there. So please let me know if you have any questions at all. I know that this was a longer video and I give you probably quite a few things to sort of ponder in your garden. I wish you the most beautiful rest of your day, and we will see you soon.